welcome to the webinar, How to Foster Inclusion, the intersection of DEI and EC. For this webinar, we plan to take a deeper dive into what organizations are currently doing to go beyond the basics and how they are evolving their EC programs to ultimately cultivate a culture of respect, belonging, and trust. Join with me today, we have Dr. Victoria Mattingly, CEO, Workplace Inclusion Scientist Practitioner, and Organizational Psychologist at Mattingly Solutions. Second, we have Masha Kha, Senior Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Uber. And third, we have Jean Holloway, Founder and Executive Director of Organizational Empowerment. Thank you guys for joining us today and for sharing your insights. Before we move into introductions, we're going to get a few housekeeping notes out of the way. Regarding Q&A, if you have any questions at any time during the webinar, please be sure to write your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We will try to address questions along the way, but we'll also leave 10 minutes at the end of the session to address any unanswered questions. If we are unable to get to your question during the webinar, we'll be sure to connect with you after. CCB CEU credits, the Compliance Certification Board has approved of this event for up to 1.2 CCB CEUs based on attending the entirety of this event. If you plan to claim these credits, so please therefore stay on until the very end. The certificate will be sent a few days after the event and will be enclosed in a follow-up email. All right, now to introductions. So to each of my speakers today, would you mind providing a brief 2 to 3 minute overview of your professional journey in the DEI space? We'll start with Dr. Victoria Mattingly.
So my journey with DEI started in 2016. So I've always been really fascinated with how can we use learning and development to result in behavior changes to make the workplace better? How do we treat each other and ourselves better through essentially soft skills, which I like to call power skills training. So that was always my emphasis, right? But when I was at Amazon, I noticed how there were only one woman in the entire C-suite, and she sat at the top of HR, which is, we all know, very important of a role, but looked at in most businesses as oh, it's outside of the business, which I always hated that. So noticed there's a lack of women, started doing women in leadership work at DDI, Development Dimensions International. And it was all this great content about, what women should do. And I'm like, well, if we look at any organizational hierarchy, like at Amazon, the higher you go up, the less women there are. And so until we get men on board, we're never gonna see any sort of substantial progress. So that's what led me to allyship. I've since grown from a gender perspective of allyship into a more intersectional approach to allyship. I've been specializing in external consulting when it comes to really quantifying workplace inclusion, which allyship fits under. I started my company, Mattingly Solutions, in August of 2019. Could never have guessed what that would have looked like a few months later, but we're doing well. We are having a lot of fun and a lot of purpose and meaning to this work, and to bring more scientific rigor to this space, while also just getting a more human-centric approach to this work from a behavioral and psychometric standpoint. But I digress. I feel like that's more than 2 minutes. I love being in this space, and I'm really excited to be joined by other people doing amazing work as well in the DEI space. So I'll pause there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Masha, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. It's great to be with you all. My name is Masha Kha, and I sit in the DC area, but I've actually spent quite some time in the Bay Area as well, in the technology space. My journey to DEI actually started when I was in high school, believe it or not. I went to a private all-girls boarding school and was one of very few minorities there. And I started prejudice reduction work there before I knew what I was doing, and ended up going to college and turning on Google's diversity team before they knew how big diversity was going to become for them. The team was about 5 people at the time. They've grown now to about 200 and 2,000 extended team members. And so I've really seen D&I from a lens of HR, people practices, how we are actively thinking about the systems and structures that we put in place. And now I focus specifically on technology. So I think about how our technology is informed by people who make decisions that sometimes are informed by bias, conscious and unconscious. I try to help those individuals to really think about what that looks like, to grow their tables and to make sure that there are more perspectives who input their thoughts into technology building. And then also that we are thinking about diverse communities and how we might impact them in a positive light. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you so much. And last but not least, Jean.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here. I'm excited. My name is Gene Holloway, the owner of Gene Holloway Consulting, LLC, and also CEO of a nonprofit called Organizational Empowerment that empowers organizations by emphasizing IO, or industrial organizational psychology concepts, into the workforce. How I came into DEI, I want to say like all my life, but I can't say that obviously, but in my professional life, right after finishing my bachelor's degree, getting my master's, and then going into education, which I thought that's where I would stay. I definitely started doing work with culturalism, multiculturalism, teaching courses in the higher ed, and then moving into leadership positions. So DEI was always at the forefront of how do we recognize some of these underrepresented groups, whether I would get involved with MOCA, Men of Color Association, that helped minority males on campuses to be able to get through their first 2-3 years and graduate. So in the higher ed, it was always a focus on getting them to persist, to get an education, to go off into the career. But then I did work in the nonprofit space where my really heart kind of lied in, is looking at sometimes the resources were not there. So how do we help organizations to be very diverse, to be inclusive, and to challenge some of the biases that they have known traditionally to have, and they can get away with it. So my goal was to be able to come back to them, to share with them some of the principles that I learned through IO, and also just have that heart to be able to make that change. Along that journey, I have been in my work doing things by helping people to be informed by how these terms and concepts, microaggressions, ableism, critical race theory, how these concepts that are very hot topic debated areas, how can we help them to be able to, what's your organization going to do to increase your DEI metrics, and making sure that your stakeholders know that we are going to be accountable, not because it's regulatory, but because DEI is good for everyone, and it creates results. It creates diverse results financially. So my goal was to, in my consulting over the last 7 to 8 years, is to really show return on investment. This has been a journey, though, I would say, working with organizations that were really excited to embrace you at first. And then when it comes down to actually making decisions and putting dollars to it, it has not always been easy because multiple priorities come up. So I definitely will represent that of all the rejection along with the victories in this journey, and how moving forward, I think as a whole, how we can work together as an experts to really help organizations to triumph. So with that, I'm glad to be here today on this panel. I don't feel like I am the only male. I just feel like I am here with a bunch of great people. In my organization, I'm 99% female as well, but I was raised by a single mother. I've never felt uncomfortable around women, and I really appreciate what they add in value. And that is part of my goal too, is increasing everyone's value around me in the workforce. So with that, I will stop.
Well, and thank you, Jean, for bringing gender diversity to the table today, because it's important. I feel like we're always talking about it one directional, but you're bringing a perspective that we wouldn't have if you were here today. So I just want to call that out as well. But sorry.
Appreciate that, Dr. V. Appreciate that, Dr. V.
Of course, of course.
See, guys, we haven't even jumped in. We're already having great conversation. But before we do start the conversation, let's take a quick poll to better understand how our audience is doing in the DEI space today. We'll give a few seconds for everyone to respond. So if you could just put in your answer, we'd love to see how you're doing today in DEI. All right, so we have a mixed audience. I'm glad to see that everyone is at least in the beginning stages for the most part of creating a DEI program. We have about 42% of our audience in the early stages feeling like their DEI program needs more development. So we'll have to talk about those early stages as well. And we have 34% in the moderate zone where you have solid foundations but would like to take it deeper. And then 21% of our audience is excelling in this area, being well established. So that's great to see. We'll try to cover all angles today. And today we'll be discussing some of the trending topics for 2022 and best practices for DEI programs in the workplace. So on that, I'd like to share a recent quote from a VP of DEI from an international energy company. They say, the real value of DEI programs is that most people aren't going to read books or know who Brene Brown is. The only place where people can come together to learn about DEI is the workplace. It's an opportunity to bring people together and to expose them to things that they wouldn't ordinarily learn that may help them in and outside of the workplace. So to our panelists, does this position on DEI resonate with your experience and expertise? And what, in your opinion, is the real value of having a DEI program? And how would you advise organizations on cultivating an organizational perspective in this area? And anyone can jump in. We'll just have a flowing conversation today.
Well, I'll hop in just because the silence is there, and I had some thoughts. I think I do agree that the workplace is a space to really dive into conversations that are hard to have in other spaces. I don't know that it's the only space. And so that is one thing that kind of piqued my interest. I think that it is a space that we're leveraging right now because we have a group of hopefully non-homogeneous individuals in a space that are trying to actively work towards one goal. And so that creates a kind of healthy tension and a need for the diversity and equity and inclusion. Now, with regard to the other spaces that I think exist in the world for this, I think it's really about the individuals who seek out those same healthy tension environments. So where are you going where you might find a community that is more diverse, that is working towards a similar goal, and that is willing to face that healthy tension together? That might be a church for someone. It could be a community organization. It may be an interest group like a ballet class or a yoga space. I think that people are having the conversation. It's just happening in different pockets of the world. And I think the workplace happens to be one space where if you don't have it, you will miss the curve of the future, which is growing increasingly more diverse.
I definitely agree that this work, and for the work to permeate and to actually be a culture shift, I think people underestimate that, especially I think people I'm an IO psychologist as well, Jean. I'm a huge IO advocate. So like, I love that you're spreading the word about IO psychology. But, going into the space, I knew it was, just focused on the organization. I do feel like that's a powerful lever. And especially it's one of the few environments where there is this contract going in that like, this is how we do things here. And if you can't get on board with the fact, this is how we treat people here, and this is how we approach hiring here, and this is how we approach our culture work here, then you can't be here. Versus in society where we need to we get to pick and choose a little more. And so that being said, it's culture shift. We're changing minds, we're changing behaviors, we're changing how we operate in a context. And that requires all levels of the ecosystem, right? And it's our family, it's our community, it's our workplace, it's our country, and so I think it's both, right? It's both. I absolutely agree with what Masha said, but also I love that as an IO psychologist, we're leveraging this context at this moment in time and building hopefully the structures that whenever it's not the hot topic that it is right now, it's already embedded because it's how the organization's DNA it operates, right? So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Dr. B. And I should appreciate your answers. And me, I think in the organization, it gives us an opportunity to be present. And I want to break that down, what I mean by that. In my presence, I'm always bringing an African-American male. I'm bringing all my experiences. I'm also a veteran. There's things that are in my life that represent me, that have been a part of who I am. I bring those dimensions to the organization. I recently was asked to work with a higher ed group who are working with mathematicians, or these math instructors, and they were like, what does math have to do with minority groups? Or how can you help us to understand how we can better understand minority groups? So 99% Caucasian male staff for mathematics at this college, and they were serving a very diverse population. So in just a nutshell, without going too far, I said, hey, that classroom where it was they were coming to learn mathematics is actually that's your place of learning now. In today's times, when we're talking about DEI, the diversity that the individuals that are coming into these classes bring and represent, from intersexuality, from sexuality to all these different aspects, neurodiversity, that gives you, as an instructor, that most of them were above 40, 50, 60 years old, that gives them an opportunity to grow and learn how to interact with the diversity that's represented in them. So the organizations, as she was mentioned, healthy tension, churches, places I go to, that's usually a healthy tension, but some of the organizations we're going to be serving or helping, those tensions are not healthy. There are sometimes lots of microaggressions, people overtly racism is happening in organizations. And with that, my thought was, well, how do you bring people together who have power and to let go of that power, in a sense, or share that power with the students who are recipients of trying to get this knowledge? It is not an easy task, but this is something that we have to do to create that change. And so I think organizations, in a way, they actually create a sense of tension that can be unhealthy in most cases. And we have to come in there and help them to really expose exactly, this is a learning environment, not just one way, it's both ways. I'm learning about the people who are not like me at all, or in my biases that I would never be that way, or I don't think I was born that way. How do I embrace that to really get something out of it? So being able to really bring that commonality to a group, an organization, is so important of the consultant.
Thank you all. Those are very powerful answers and great ways to think about how our DEI work impacts our workplace, but also beyond. So our second question for you is, many of us have seen the headlines following former Miami Dolphins head coach, Brian Flores, who is filing a class action lawsuit against the NFL alleging racial discrimination in hiring. While the lawsuit itself is still in progress, it raises important questions about what meaningful behavioral change looks like with respect to DEI. How can organizations ensure that they are inspiring new behaviors rather than simply checking the box in this area?
I'll jump out there first. I love football. Not that that should be a part of my answer at all, but I understand it's a big beast. And when it comes to DEI, my goal was to attempt to be everywhere that I can to see where I can make a difference. I was pretty much didn't have an opportunity. I reached out to those in this field, but I do have some connections. So it's very difficult in this space to make big change when people have lots of power, lots of billions of dollars, and getting them to change behavior. But what I think has happened with Mr. Flores is that it now no longer than before, things are going to be exposed. And whether or not legally it will change anything, it still allows social media and people at large to be able to talk about what are the practices looking like when they're hiring these coaches, these individuals, and what are some of the things that represent what happens in everyday communities and organizations when it comes to overt racism or systemic difference in treatment by people of different races, colors, and all that things just gets us to talk about it. And then hopefully organizations can grab that information. How does that relate to their organization? What are things that are happening on that they're not talking about, and where can they make changes? And it's not always about bottom dollar. How are we just going, how is this making us money or not making us money? How is this going to affect the overall health and how people feel and experience the organization? So I was surprised by it, but was not surprised at all. We probably go NBA, soccer, we can go all these different things, these different areas where these types of things are likely happening all the time. So that would be my share on that.
So I'm not a huge football fan, but I am from Pittsburgh, so I have to be a Steelers fan or else they kick you out here. And so the Rooney Rule originated in the NFL, which so there's a requirement that for any open lead coach position, I think maybe most coach positions, hopefully, you have to interview at least one coach of color, right? That's the Rooney Rule. But I wanted to share something in the chat, if I can do that. And so there's this really great study done by Stephanie Johnson and her team from CU Boulder, where they did a study and they found if there was one woman, so if there's one underrepresented group member in any hiring pool out of 4, it's almost statistically impossible for that person to get hired. I'm not entirely sure like how the math works, but she makes a great case for it in this research. And so the Rooney Rule doesn't even work, even when it plays out right. We need to have systems and structures in place to make sure we're having structured interviews where everyone's getting the same questions, that we're blinding the process as much as possible. Like even whenever the orchestra, there's this study about, the orchestra was trying to blind their auditions so they could get more gender representation or just diverse representation in general. And even though they had people go behind the curtains, they could still hear the high heels because it's a very formal, attire that everyone has to wear. And so once they took the shoes off, once there were no shoes and people were asked to audition shoeless, they finally got to a place of gender equity as they started filling the roles, because that's how pervasive that was. So the Rooney Rule, yes, it was a step in the right direction, but clearly there's tokenism happening. Clearly there's, some practices and people in leadership roles who are making bad decisions. And so I feel really bad for this coach that he's going through this experience, but I'm really glad that he's fighting and that we're having this conversation right now and getting into a space like football fans, NFL, people who don't usually think about these concepts of like, oh, like, this is why that DEI stuff matters, even in our realm of the world, in this football space that I don't spend much time in.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Victoria and Jean on this. And I think that the thing that comes up for me is with regard to a model that Deloitte Consulting actually put together, and it is called the D&I Revolution. And essentially it talks about the movement from a compliance-based D&I program to an integrated D&I program. And there are 2 steps between it. It's not a huge model. It really talks about compliance, and then programmatic efforts, and then leader-led efforts, and finally integrated efforts. And I think the goal is really to be able to move people from the compliance space to the space of how do we integrate that. That might be an example, Victoria, in terms of take off your shoes when you're dancing, when you come to interview. It's an integrated way that now it's just a standard practice that creates equity. And that's the kind of thinking that we need our D&I leaders and our leaders at large to start to employ, because checking that box, simply meeting the compliance factors or the rules, is no longer going to be acceptable, because people are expecting more from us as corporations, as communities, and as leaders. And so I think it's really around how do we systematically and also habitually make changes that are going to help us to move that needle. And because Dr. Victoria is so good about her resources, I will try to add the link to that model in the chat as well.
Oh, I'm like on it. I got you.
There you go. No worries.
I'm very interested in it. Oh yeah. Masha's. Oh, thank you, Masha. Thank you. I love that.
Ariana, as a caveat to that, I also want to say one of the things that's kind of been really been on my mind and in my practice. So say, for instance, we were talking about Mr. Flores, who is an African-American male coach, and the situation that happened to him. The moment that we mentioned, like Dr. V shared something about female CEOs and names and everything like that. I think sometimes what happens is people in general think we're trying to isolate individuals, or we're not paying attention to the African-American male, now we're paying attention to female. And it takes a lot of head work, studious, intentional work to say like, no, we have to be intentional on how we move a crowd or move our audience to not, hey, we're trying to give sympathy just for women because women don't have this, or just for men. people are suffering in just about every aspect of life, disabilities, invisible disabilities. So how do you keep all those things at the forefront when, hey, the title says this is about a football who's an African-American coach? So there's so much suffering and so much discrimination and things that are happening. I think it's really important that the consultant know that the audience then, what about the white Caucasian or the male or the female who's saying, well, this is just another take on how I have my white privilege and I don't have the opportunity to talk about my sufferings. So no, that's not the case. Even though we need to give opportunity for more people of color and make things equitable, still, we're not trying to get that equity so then we can forget about you who don't look like me. Right. And that's important work in this, because so many organizations are just like, just tell me how many Hispanics I need to get, how many African-Americans need to get, so then we can move on to doing what we were doing before. That is not appropriate, and that should not happen, but it does happen. And we need to be able to talk about that.
Well, because they don't take the double click down. It's not just like, how do we get the numbers to look right, but then how do we build a culture and an operational, a successful workplace where everyone has the opportunity to thrive and meet their potential, right? And that's not just a DEI problem. That's a talent problem. That's a culture problem. And doing this right is just integrating it into all those things. But something else you said, Jean, that I wanted to follow up on was this, how do we get the conversation out of us versus them, out of zero-sum game, out of like, well, if there's only so much pie, and if we give the pie to others, then we're going to like miss out on that. And I'm trying to uncouple like the individual defensiveness of like, I hear myself in this. We're talking about gender. I have a gender. We're talking about race. I have a race. I see myself in this. And so I worry about like, I'm going to lose, or it's us versus them. How do we elevate from putting it at the individual level and elevate to the group level, right? I want a workplace. I want a board. I want a panel. I want a panel where we have diverse representation. That is so important at all those levels. And if we can all get on board with that, the older white male could hopefully get more involved in these efforts, because they don't see it as an attack against them. They see it as an opportunity to increase all the things that are already on their strategic goals anyway, but doing it through the diversification of their workforce. And then that double click down of actually building the structures to support all those people when they're there.
So the executive leadership, I know you want to go on, there's my questions, Ariana, but the executive leadership training and other things that I had to go through and be certified to work with that group, I think that was a way for me, being an African-American male, is I want to understand what you know so that you don't think me as a threat. I'm not coming here to get a privilege or an opportunity based on how I look. I'm going to understand what ROI is and what all these concepts are and what marketing strategies are. Why do I do that? So that can lower your defense mechanism, that I'm just in here to take something when I'm actually here to give something. I'm actually here to bring unity, to actually bring you to a point to where I connect to your heart, right? If we're talking about those people who are at the top, somehow you got to get it off the money and connect to that heart, to where they really are, what they thought this life was all about, and be able to connect them back to the people that they're serving. In some ways, there's so many servant leadership. There's so many different ways in which throughout the year, theorists and people have tried to do that. I think, how do we bring it home in today's times to where we're really trying to really make that impact, and then make that impact on all levels, from the executive level down to the mid-management, down to the employee. I think we have to be thinking about all of those different variables and factors when we're working with an organization today.
Guys, this has been a great conversation, and I think it really leads into our next question, which is centering around the importance of setting tone at the top, something we frequently talk about in the E&C space. So what do leaders need to do to ensure that these DEI commitments are indeed impactful and genuine?
My thought process with regard to what leaders should do and the tone that they should consider, and this might be counter to kind of the moral imperative behind D&I. I do really try to lean into the competitive business advantage that D&I brings, because again, we're all at our workplace to achieve a goal, and usually that goal is a bottom line of sorts. And I think that oftentimes people lose sight of that bottom line being influenced by the larger pie that they can grow. So meaning, if we get more people to my table is likely to have more money, more access, more resource, more knowledge, more sharing, more everything. Now, the concern that I think often plagues leaders is that this is the right thing to do. And they feel like, there's this conversation around if they don't do it, then they're somehow morally bankrupt or at fault in some way. And I think that's the thing that we have to get off the table. We have to take the shame and the guilt of the why we are here off of the table. We have to get leaders to understand that none of us created this problem. None of us here discussing it that are working on it, none of us as leaders in the organization specifically created this problem. Now, we might be upholding systems and structures that keep it in place, but that's what we should be working to dismantle after we take our own shame, our own guilt off of the conversation space. Because what I think is actually happening is we're paralyzing our leaders with many asks, many requests. Jean, I think you talked about the concept of all of the different identities and all of the different perspectives that people could be taking in diversifying their workforce. And for me, it's about getting leaders to understand that it's one day at a time, one action at a time, one person at a time makes the larger pie. And if we can continuously move forward in the right direction, either by taking a stance on one particular issue, meaning hiring or retention or systems and policies or structures, everybody gets their little piece, then we'll start to see change. But right now, every single person has two things that they're bringing to the table that are counterproductive: shame and guilt. And then the last piece is really the feeling that they have to fix everything at once. And that's not going to work.
There's so much, if I could plus one, like all the points you just made, Masha, because that's really, we're never going to get anywhere if we don't get past that shame and guilt. And it's such a fascinating space to be in. And I'm so grateful I came from a psychology background doing this work versus a business background, because there's so much of that psychological, like the uncoupling again of your own identity and like this higher level, like group level work that DEI truly is, and working through shame and guilt, and also working across all differences, right? Because we've doubled down on some identities in some ways, right? Having all these different ways of looking at intersectionality, are we further dissecting all these different groups, and how do we start building the tools to talk across them and taking a more intersectional approach? And I think it's about building the system, building the function to then plug in where it makes sense from. Because like having a conversation about what people with physical disabilities need in the workplace is a very different conversation with someone who has a same-sex partner, but not the right health, they're getting health insurance. And what should that conversation look like, right? So like, how do we build necessary, like these triggers where when we get a new policy, we need to make sure we talk to all these different type of groups and figure out, how it's going to serve or disadvantage them in some way. How do we build the process to ensure we get the voices in, but not feel like everyone needs to become an expert in everything, because this space is shifting all the time. And I always say the goal isn't to always get it right. The goal is that we create a culture that when we get it wrong, you can listen to that and accept that and change moving forward, rather than being called out. Well, I'm not sexist, I'm not racist, I'm not homophobic. It's like, no, like we just say it a different way now. It's just a different term now. Thank you for telling me that. I didn't know. I'm going to try to use that term moving forward. Same with pronouns, right? It's not that I have this pronoun and you must get it right, or else I'm going, or else you're wrong and I'm going to cancel you, right? No, like when you're trying, and when you do get it wrong, I give you that grace. Be like, no, remember it's they now, and okay, oh, thank you for the reminder. Like, how do we create that? How do we focus on that being the outcome rather than having to feel like getting it all right, knowing all the things, doing all the things at the same time, because you're absolutely right, Masha. That's just going to overwhelm and cause the burnout that we're seeing. And it's not going to be productive.
Thank you both first for sharing that. I wanted to jump in and just talking about the importance from leadership down. They need to be looking at how their people in their organization, how they view themselves. What do they say about their diversity? As I just put in the chat for my group of colleagues, I work together with an organization in Australia, which is outside of the United States. People come here from all over the world to be a part of the United States, and they're very successful. We're the melting pot. So part of it being intentional in my consulting is that I wanted to connect with some leaders that are in other countries and get their perspective on what's going on outside. And so when I do my work here and I have people who from different countries, different nations, or have heritage or their families who are different, I wanted them to see that, hey, I want you to be able to, it's okay to identify with those differences, because we have so much stuff that's going on. So it's important that the leaders are willing to let the people at the bottom in the middle be able to express what their diversity is, instead of just building a plan to solve something or to end racism or a reaction to some social injustice, which may create change, but will it change at a systemic level? Will it really get all to buy in? And I think that's where we have to come with. Many times we talk about microaggressions, and everyone should know about that, but microaffirmations are just important, just leaning from the positive. Microaffirmations, a small gesture of inclusion, caring, or kindness. They include listening, providing comfort and support, being an ally, and explicitly valuing the contributions and presence of all. It is particularly helpful for those with greater power or seniority to model affirming behavior. So that's what I would say to leaders, affirming that you want to know what their diversity is, and then thanking them for being a part of that organization with their diversity, whether it be religion, whether it be sexuality, whether it be neurodiversity, no matter what it is. So this tool that I've used with this nonprofit I work with has allowed these dimensions to be uncovered with an organization. Then the leaders can look at what is the data showing them about their diversity? What are people saying their diversity looks like? What are the different languages represented in their organization? And then build something based on what the data is showing. Current data, not old HR data, not stuff that's, oh, we already have that information. Why should we waste any money in there? Well, you're telling me you don't want to invest in what people are saying about themselves now because you're intimidated? You think it's going to go somewhere? You have no control over how it's going to go? There's a lot of real fear that leaders have when it comes to really exposing what people say, how diverse they are. Accommodations. What are we going to have to change? Is that going to mess up our bottom line, our bottom dollar? So they need that assistance and support through consultants to be like, we can do it all and we can still make these changes.
Can I share a quick story about microaffirmations? So one of my favorite partners I work with, Gigi Gilliard, she's amazing. I will drop her info in the chat in a moment. But she and I were building out some content together, and I love microaffirmations. I'm all about we need to know what not to do, right? But let's start focusing on what we can do moving forward. People are ready. Let's help get them there. And so I love microaffirmations. I was doing all this stuff about microaffirmations and this content we were building. And I was like, so don't worry about microaggressions, just focus on the microaffirmations. And we had a really intense conversation about that, about, what privilege do I have that I think we can just gloss over the microaggressions part, right? And you don't even fully understand the power of microaffirmations if you don't understand the microaggressions that they're trying to actively, counter. And so I'm trying to strike that balance between where do we still have that accountability for the microaggressions, but also focusing on the micro affirmations. And then something else, the other day, someone called out that it's the use that it's not just micro affirmations, but the equitable use of micro affirmations. Because if I had a gender preference and I was using all my micro affirmations on Masha, and not giving Jean any micro affirmation. Now, I'm not giving any microaggressions either, Jean. It's just, you're not getting nearly as many micro affirmations as I'm giving Masha. You could then maybe feel that I'm excluding you as the male, and I have a female preference, right? And so it's just so fascinating, and I just love micro affirmations because I think there's a lot of power there and these subtleties, because that's what we're dealing with. And I think some of the defensiveness and guilt before, it's like, well, I'm not engaging in explicit racist things. It's not like a generation ago where we're like doing all these things. And so like, how dare you call me racist? I'm like, I'm not saying you're doing those things, but these little things are really hurting, causing harm as well, right? And so anyway, I digress. I could talk all day about microaffirmations.
I think Ariana, Dr. Thompson, that both of them have to exist at the same time, even though it can be difficult. So my example is, so micro affirmations, I think from the leadership down, are people that are in power need to be affirming and constantly be affirming. But what are they affirming against? The fact that people are experiencing microaggressions, sometimes by those same people, right? So they need to be able to hear what they are doing and be able to not get so defensive about it, because with their power, they can just deflect. Oh, I'm sorry you got that. I'm sorry you took it that. Like, what do you Black people need or here? What do you Caucasian, what do you people need? Those type of things actually can be very hurtful. But we need them to focus on affirmations, meaning like stop doing microaggressions, but we don't need them to hear what they are doing and be accountable for what they're doing. And if we're able to do that, both can happen at the same time. It can be complicated, but they should be happening at the same time.
Excellent points. I love this powerful conversation and all the energy our panelists are bringing today. We're going to switch gears just a little to talk about something top of mind for business leaders and board of directors, which is measurement. How do we know when a program is successful? When it comes to DEI, how do you measure progress?
Yeah, I will jump in here. There are several different mechanisms that we leverage to measure progress. And the first of which is just representation. So we obviously take a look at all of our organizations. We look at them by region, we look at them by leader, we look at them by function. And then we essentially say, where are our representation gaps? Where do we have opportunities to grow and develop those particular perspectives or voices in the conversation? The other space that I would say that we're constantly trying to measure is with regard to employee sentiment. So really understanding their sense of belonging, their feelings of inclusion, of upward mobility, their feelings of an ability to offer a dissenting opinion. A lot of those things, and I didn't hop in because I knew we had a long list of things we needed to chat through, but a lot of those small habits that we were talking about early really lend themselves well to micro affirmations. And I think it's about how we start to measure leadership's engagement and or impact in those spaces so that we can say, are these micro affirmations working or not working? So for example, we might look at a leader's sentiments or their employee sentiments and see that a certain percentage of the population feels as though they aren't able to have a really high visibility project, let's say. And then we go to the leader and say, your micro affirmation is to really make sure that you check all of your projects and see what the representation looks like. How do you pick up a voice that is a diverse perspective into a project that is really high visibility for you? And we would ask that leader to actually track their progress in that employee sentiment over time. And so there are a number of different dynamics that we leverage within Uber and within many technology companies that I've been at over the past 2 decades almost. And essentially, I think it really matters to be leader specific about the metrics. So each leader has to buy into the spaces that they want to either increase representation or grow their belonging scores, or think about how they might, for example, think about upward mobility or promotion or internal mobility at large. And once you have a leader specific plan, I think that's the best way to get them to buy into the overall success of the organization.
I was so excited about this question because I feel like as a DEI consultant and an IO psychologist, like the measurement part, we take these abstract concepts like job satisfaction and commitment to an organization and turn it into a measurable construct so we can actually see our gaps and set numerical goals and put interventions in place to watch those gaps close. And something about the DEI space that always drove me crazy with a psychometrics background was moving the needle. It's such a common phrase. And I actually in the beginning of doing this work, I found a lot of solace in that phrase because it can be exhausting sometimes to work so hard towards something and see very little progress. So learning how to celebrate incremental progress is important to do this work. However, how do we know if we're making progress if we're not measuring anything? And I found that because of all the different terms that all have meaning and purpose, I think we could all talk about why in the history it started with diversity, and then it was diversity inclusion. Then we added the equity. Now we're seeing belonging and accessibility and just like, and I think it's important like that we are calling out those constructs. However, what has happened is they're all getting jumbled together, right? And there is this like higher level order, right? There is this like DEI, BA, whatever construct at the top that we're trying to achieve. But until we start breaking down them at actual things that we can see, we can measure, we can do, we can change, like we're not going to make progress in a measurable way. And so when you were talking, Masha, about like feelings of inclusion and like these leader behaviors that then result in these feelings of belonging, the way that we measure, and we're actually have some grants out right now, which is really exciting to do more academic work in this space as well. But the way we measure inclusion and belonging, our inclusion are the behaviors, in a lot of cases, these micro affirmations we've been talking a lot about, but inclusion are the behaviors that result in others feeling valued, respected, seen, and heard, right? So the behaviors are the inclusion part, and that's what we can measure through 360s, through other report. We don't measure it through self-report. I don't care if you think you're the most inclusive leader in the world. I care if your people think that about you, right? And so, getting that behavioral data and then mapping it onto the belonging data. And that is self-report. I do care what you think, because this is your feeling of, can you bring your authentic best self into the workplace every day, right? And how do those two constructs relate, the behavior and the feeling? And how can we start making data-driven decisions on what we're going to focus on year over year? And this goes back also to the structure and function we were talking about before. How do we build in a regular measurement cadence so we actually can continually track this progress and communicate it back out? And I feel like that's just where a huge ball gets dropped with DEI and culture work in general, is we don't then share back what we heard, because this goes back to the voice part that you were saying before, Jean. If we don't say we heard you and we're doing XYZ about it, people aren't going to keep responding. And if there's all these things going on behind the scenes, if people don't know it, they still don't feel like you're investing in DEI, when in actuality, you might very well be, And so how do we build measurement, communications, the leader accountability, right? If that's in their 360, that's one of my biggest pieces of advice to clients when we first start working together. Where's your competency model? How are you evaluating your leaders? And how are you building inclusive behaviors into that evaluation, that you can't get a promotion and you're not going to get your full bonus if your inclusion score is through the floor, right? You got to be taking care of your people too. And so anyway, I could talk about measurement all day, so I'm going to pause. And I just love what y'all are doing at Uber, Masha. And I've heard Bo speak before, and I just think y'all are really ahead of the game and where we should be the future of DEI measurement, quite honestly. So I just kudos to y'all and your work over there.
My approach, so I'm going to think about the different people that I'm working with from, I have people who work in Deloitte, Booz Allen, Hamilton, working in the federal system myself with the Office of People Analytics, where everybody's attempting to say we're going to measure DEI. So I love what Ash was saying in the beginning about like even the representation. And to me, that's foundational, right? You need to be able to have some diversity mapping. That's the key term to me. That's not the end all be all. And I think that's what's so difficult in this space is that people are pouring lots of resources into. Now we have a diversity officer, we have a diversity chief director, and we have all these different positions that have popped up. And when I, as an individual consultant, have started reaching out to them and talking to them, saying, hey, what's going on? How are you measuring? Or like, oh, what you're doing is great, Gene, but we just hired this person. This person's going to do that. So there's like a certain learning curve that they're going to have to where this person, they pumped $100,000 or $150,000 into this position. They don't have any more budget for anything else, right? These are things I'm like, that's not going to work. That's not going to give long-term success. It's not going to deal with how complex this issue is. Just as Dr. V says, DEI, right? Each one of those areas should have, how are we measuring each one of those areas? Well, we have to know, how do we measure them? Is it valid? Is it reliable? How are we approaching that? And sometimes that answer could be no, right? So they're just saying, hey, why don't you just tell us, how do we get to X from where we're at now? And we can't just do that. We have to be willing to measure things over time and show progress. Another thing that's been kind of important, and I've been kind of looking at a lot, is the ERGs groups. Some groups I talk about, employee resource groups, saying this is it, right? This is one avenue. And I've seen high-tech global companies do it in a positive way, to where they're really leveraging those different groups in their organization to get information from those groups that then will inform the leadership, which will inform policy, and then they can measure all of those things, right? But some organizations I talk to, they don't want ERGs. No, that's a way of divisive. It's having people have. So these are things I think that we need to discuss about and be able to have measures to everything that we are doing, right? And being in the IO world, yes, I believe we have a way of being able to break those things down, to share that with people in a way to where they can understand it. And yes, we will monitor it and make sure that we are seeing progress over time, but that does cost dollars. So then we go back to business. Can we really communicate to them the return on their investment into using this? And if we're able to do that, then we can do this research, do this work in a way that moves the needle and gives accountability for measuring in all these different ways. One thing I loved about psychology when I first came on board, they were like, everything that we know, we're still learning about it. Meaning that I was like, what? So you mean to tell me sometimes they can be proven wrong? You were so confident that something was this way, and then more research has shown that it really wasn't that way, that this is where it's at. I had to accept that, be like, I'm always going to be growing in this body of knowledge in a topic, in an area. I love that about psychology. Sometimes in the business world, they're like, no, we just need an absolute, man. You need to tell us this is how it's going to go, and this is how it's going to be. And we have to be able to communicate to them how complex this issue can be in measuring it. Sorry, I got so excited.
Excellent. No, like I said, I love the passion. I know we need to jump into Q&A, but Masha, I'm curious if you have any commentary you want to add before we move on to that around employee resource groups and how you do them at Uber.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things I would call out. One is there's a difference between an employee resource group and a business resource group. And I think what Jean talks about with regard to people having this aversion to employee resource groups is that sometimes they can kind of be breeding grounds for negativity or like negative experiences that people share in an organization. I think the goal would be, whether you decide that you would like your resource groups to be focused on the employees and how they experience the workspace, or focus on the business and how they might help to develop business goals, think about outreach, think about reviewing objectives for the business, that you are really intentional about creating spaces that allow people to work towards a positive outcome. So the thing that I've noticed in these ERGs is sometimes you'll just get people into a room and say, have at it. What discussion is everyone open to? If you come to the conversation with, what can we do better? How can we improve? What are some opportunities to highlight and celebrate the diversity that this group brings? And what are the challenges that you're facing, not with an eye towards or an ear towards complaining, but an ear towards challenging the system at play and thinking about ways to progressively move forward. And so I think it's really in large part in the development of the conversations that you're having, and making sure that the leaders who are running those groups are very clear and aligned with that development.
Masha, quick follow-up to that. Do you think it's possible to do both if the right facilitation and structures in place?
I think it's possible to do both, but again, it's about resourcing. So yeah, you know, when you're going to give a certain pot of money, you have to make sure that, and we do, I'll be honest, I think at Uber and several other tech companies that I've worked at, we give a lot of money to our employees, and then we ask them to bifurcate that cash. So some of it goes to employee resourcing and morale, and other pieces of it go towards how do we leverage this really powerful group of individuals to be a beacon of representation for our organization externally.
I have a real live example. Recently, I was brought on to talk with a group, a very successful business group. It was the BIPOC group that actually wanted me to speak to me. As I spoke to that group, it became very apparent that some individuals in the group just really were burdened down by feeling like I see no representation above me. I'm African-American female and there's no African-American females in leadership. And I just feel I've been here 8 years. And as a consultant, I was doing a lot of listening to them. But then I realized, fast forward, I'm ready to do a proposal, ready to work with the group. The decision makers weren't in the room, which is very important. So this group in the end was seen as, hey, we already give you resources. Thank you for reaching out to a consultant and then allowing that consultant to share what that person can do. We're going to use our own consultant. Basically, that group was seen as a threat. So whatever dimensions were going on between them communicating their needs or being disappointed about what's going on in the organization appeared to come as a threat to those in leadership. And they were saying, we're hearing what you're saying, but we're going to go and get somebody else because they're perceiving them as a threat. And I think that's could happen quite often, but in this situation, very disappointing, right? Because in no way did I want to be a threat to leadership. Actually, I thought the next move would have been like, okay, they're going to set up a meeting with me. They're going to get to know me first and see if I even and what they need, right? But they just totally disregarded what this recommendation was coming from this. And it was lawyers and doctors, very, very smart individuals, bright individuals who have been with the company for many years. But the perception was that it's you against us, and anything you're recommending, we're going to go against it. And what's really sad to me. So then lastly, I reached out to the person who recommended me to talk to this group. I was like, do you see what's going on? She said, yeah, they did this last year too. I left the company because we made recommendations and they looked at us and said, you know what, we're going to go our own direction. So somehow we have to speak to that, how leaders can feel threatened by some of these ERG groups because of the complaints maybe they may see. It may be legit things that they're enduring, right? But how does the consultant come in there and says, I'm going to work with these individuals, you as an individual have professional development plans, work with them, because that African-American lady should be applying for an executive leadership position. But are you getting the support and training that you need? And maybe the way that you're coming off to leadership, maybe that you're not going to fit our culture. Are you going to be a part of the team? Well, working with leadership, I always have to talk to them. What do you think that says to people who are beneath you? They need to be a part of the culture. They need to be a part of the team. Because you don't want somebody to get in there who's going to cause havoc and mess up the flow of everything, right? Because you might quit and go somewhere else. You're an executive. So all of these dynamics, I think the consultant has to be thinking about and at least try to reflect that, hey, that's a possibility. That's a variable I need to consider. Let me make sure if I get an opportunity to talk to these leaderships, if I'm able to get that opportunity, I want to show them I understand that there's different complexities with this issue, because if you don't get past that, the decision makers are not going to pay the money. I'm just talking as an external consultant. As an internal consultant, sometimes there's different leverages you may have. As an external consultant, you may be competing against several different things just to help out that ERG group to be successful.
Thanks, Jean and whole group. Those have been some really great notes. Unfortunately, I think we accidentally rushed over our Q&A time. So if you are in the audience and have additional questions, please do reach out and connect with all of our amazing panelists, and we will definitely try and get your questions answered. A big shout out and thank you to all of our panelists today. And I have a reminder for our audience as you leave, a survey will pop up after this event. Please take 2 minutes to provide feedback on this webinar so we can continue to improve in the future. And anyone in the chat, if you can give a big shout out to our panelists today, we'd much appreciate the support. Thank you for attending, and it was great to have you here.